Hey everyone, so today I'm talking about the Canon RP, and I've owned this camera for about a year and a half now, and when I bought it, I was actually really surprised at how much I liked this camera and how good the quality, the image quality in this camera was. And I've talked a lot before about the value of the price versus what you're getting from this camera. I mean, we're talking about a mirrorless full frame camera under $1,000, as well as the image quality that you get out of a camera that is as compact as this camera is. And honestly, I do definitely think that the image quality out of this camera holds up for professional work in a lot of cases. But I am selling the camera, and this is not clickbait. I am getting rid of it. And so in the video, I'm going to talk about why I'm getting rid of this camera, what I'm switching to, and what or whether maybe you should get a Canon RP or sell one if you already have it. So usually with the camera specs, I typically just do kind of a quick overview of the specs that are in the camera before I start talking about the camera, but I've already done a full review on the Canon RP, and I'll link that here if you want to see that, and I'll go over the specs in that way. But in this video, I wanted to talk more about what the camera can actually do, so kind of putting the specs in context. And first of all, again, this is a full frame sensor, 20.2 megapixel photos, and I am consistently impressed with the quality of the photos that come from this camera. From a sub $1,000 camera, I still don't think you can find anything that beats the quality of these images at this price range. And then there's also dual pixel autofocus in this camera, and this autofocus system is really good. It is not as good as the current generation of mirrorless cameras. So we're talking Canon R3, R5, R6, or Sony A7S III, or Sony A1, something like that. It's not as good as those, but for anything this generation of cameras, and certainly any full frame camera at this price point, it is easily at the top of the pack as far as autofocus performance goes. And as long as you're not shooting something like fast action, it is not going to hold you back. The autofocus performance will keep up with stuff that isn't fast action. And while we're on the subject of shooting action, the realistic performance of what you can get from the burst shutter mode in photos with this camera is about 2.6 frames per second. And again, this camera is just not for action. If you shoot action, it's not going to work for you, probably depending on how you shoot, I guess, but in general, it's not an action camera. But if you don't shoot action, then that probably doesn't matter so much. And I don't shoot action, so for me, it has never mattered and it has been fine. When it comes to video, this is realistically primarily a 1080 camera, and it has good 1080 up to 60 frames per second in 1080. We technically do have 4K on this camera, but the 4K has several issues. The 1.7 times crop, we don't have dual pixel autofocus in 4K, and the autofocus that we do have is really bad. On top of that, it has really terrible rolling shutter performance in 4K, and overall the 4K on this camera just is not usable, so I don't even count this camera as being a 4K camera. But as I've said a lot of times, 1080 works really well for anything that you're putting online, social media, YouTube. If you film in 1080 and then upscale that and export it to 4K, that actually works really well for YouTube content. So I do think that this camera is still relevant in video for the right shooter. And another thing with this camera is that it only has one SD card slot, so for a lot of wedding shooters and some event shooters, that's probably not going to work. But if you're not shooting weddings or action or something like this, the camera is actually really good for a lot of different types of shooters. And again, at this price point, the quality that you're getting out of the camera is really impressive. So I'm sitting here and I'm talking about how impressed I am with the quality that comes out of the camera for the price and the size. And I'm not a wedding shooter, I'm not an action shooter, but I'm selling the camera. So why is it that I'm not sticking with this camera? So I want to talk about some of the pros and cons with this camera, and first specifically pros and cons for photography. And I'm going to start with the pros, and there are, again, a lot of pros for this camera, especially considering the price point, which is the first pro. The image quality that you get out of this camera for under $1,000. Full frame, 26.2 megapixels, and 26.2 megapixels is going to be more than enough resolution for most shooters, especially if your content is going to end up on the web primarily. That's going to be enough resolution even for cropping in a decent amount. And I've never had an instance where I was shooting with this camera and thought that I needed more resolution. We also get great colors with this camera, flexible RAW files. The autofocus performance, again, is solid for anything that's not really fast action. And it also has solid low light performance. So shooting high ISOs, even up to like 6400, I'm completely happy with the quality coming out of the RP. Add a little bit of noise reduction if I get into the higher ISOs, but I'm fine with how it comes out looking with this. And then definitely the thing that I'm going to miss most about the RP is that quality that comes in such a compact size. So this has been, since I bought it, my go-to camera for if I'm trying to take something small and light, if I don't want to take a whole camera bag and I just want to have one camera on a camera strap or something like that, I always grab this RP. And if you pair this with something like the RF 50mm f1.8, that is a really tiny but high quality package that you can really almost fit into your back pocket. So it's a great way to have a subtle but pro quality camera setup, and that can help in a lot of situations if you're trying to get some photos and you don't want anyone coming up and asking, you know, what are you shooting for, and do you have permits to shoot for this, and that kind of thing. So that can come in really handy, and I will miss that part of having the RP. But the most important pro for this camera, and the reason why I tend to recommend it so often, is because of the image quality that you get for the price. And with this price where it is, honestly, its competition is primarily entry-level and APS-C cameras, and the image quality that you're going to get from this camera will easily beat entry levels and APS-C cameras pretty much any day. And if you're starting out and trying to get a pro setup, or if you're moving from an entry-level camera and trying to go pro, but you don't have a big selection of quality lenses, every single time I will recommend that you save some of your budget by going with something like this RP and investing the rest of that budget into higher quality like Canon L lenses, because that's going to make a much bigger difference in your image quality than if you were to get a more expensive camera and skimp a little bit on the amount of lenses or the quality of lenses that you could buy. So now I do want to talk about some of the cons in photography, and to be fair, for a full frame camera at this price point, there are not many, keeping this price point in mind. But when you talk about full frame mirrorless cameras and compare this to other full frame mirrorless cameras, and you're trying to keep it in this price point, there have to be some compromises. And one of them for me is the shutter options. So this camera automatically is going to shoot almost always with an electronic first curtain shutter. Now, there is a single option to shoot with an all electronic shutter in fully silent mode, but the only way to do that is with a specific option in one of the creative shooting menus for silent, and that forces you to shoot in an completely auto mode. So you don't have any control of your settings that way. So for most people shooting, especially if you're paying the money for a full frame mirrorless camera, that's not really going to cut it or be useful for most people. So realistically, you're only going to be shooting with an electronic first curtain shutter. And to be fair, in most shooting situations, it's fine and isn't going to be problematic. But there are a few situations where that can bring about some issues. So if you have no idea what an electronic first curtain shutter is, basically it's a mix of using an electronic shutter and a mechanical shutter at the same time. And again, in most cases, you're not even going to know, but there are situations that come up that can be problematic. So for me, I've been shooting in studio with strobe, so off-camera flash, a lot more often recently. And with this shutter, the electronic first curtain shutter on the RP, the flash sync speed, maximum flash sync speed is 1/180. And because of the way that flash works when you're shooting in studio, the sync speed like that, that's not an issue that it's a little bit slower than other cameras. In most cases, in studio with flash, you're not going to notice that. If you're outdoors, it could be a little bit of an issue sometimes, but when you're in studio, it doesn't make a difference really. But when shooting specifically with this electronic first curtain shutter on the RP, I have run into some issues when using off-camera flash where the shutter timing is just a little bit off, and so like half or third or part of your image is just completely black because the shutter hasn't moved away in time for the flash sync. And again, it's been inconsistent, so you can still definitely get shots on here. And if you're shooting like still life, like you just have a product shot set up and you can just take another shot as much as you want, you can certainly still get the image and it won't necessarily ruin the shoot. But if you are shooting something moving with studio strobes, then that can definitely potentially be problematic because the one shot you got that had the right action could be the one where the shutter was in the way. So again, that's a pretty specific use case, and if you're a natural light photographer only, it's obviously not going to affect your shooting. And again, it's inconsistent, so I can't say that it's going to affect your shooting all the time, even if you are shooting in the studio with strobes. But for me, that's enough that I can't rely on it in that situation. And because I'm shooting in that situation more and more, that's become a bigger and bigger factor with me. Another thing is, I keep saying this is an awesome camera for the price. But if we look at other price points, it's not as good as more expensive cameras. And this is always the case with camera gear. The more you pay, the more features that you're going to get from the cameras typically. And it's always a case of, what do I need? What features are going to help me get the shots that I need or going to be very important for my workflow? And how much does it cost me to get those features? So it's always a question of matching your needs with the price range that you have. And things like, for instance, if you are an action shooter, you probably will need a faster burst shooting mode than this RP has to offer. And really most of these cons are going to be with taking the price out of the picture. So for instance, the ISO performance at this price range, it's really good. But if you take the price out of the picture, the more expensive mirrorless modern cameras have much better ISO performance. And I will say that for most shooters, the ISO performance on the RP is not going to be restrictive. It is solid. And again, when we keep the price range in mind, you're competing against APS-C cameras, and it's definitely going to do fine in high ISO compared to that. But when we're comparing high ISO performance and even dynamic range performance to more expensive cameras, it's going to fall behind a bit. Now, dynamic range, again, I've found that it hasn't been restricted for me, and I do think that this is going to be a divisive topic, and it really depends on what you shoot and how you shoot as to how much dynamic range you are going to require from a camera. For most shooters, I don't think the dynamic range is going to be a problem in the RP. Again, keeping budget in mind, I think it's actually one of the pros of the camera. But when we take budget out of the picture, there are plenty of camera options with more dynamic range than the RP. And that's kind of the story of this camera. Like, for the budget, for most shooters, it's going to be the best option. But then you have to ask, like, well, is it worth it for me to invest more money into a camera body to get some better performance, some better features? Or is it worth it for my situation to save money on the camera body and invest more in lenses or lighting or other peripheral gear that's going to give me better image quality that way? And not only the price, but also the form factor, the size is a big question when it comes to the RP. Is a little bit better performance in certain areas going to be worth carrying around a bigger camera? And of course, the other side of that coin is, well, if you are using bigger lenses, are they going to balance a little better and maybe feel a little better if you do have the bigger camera body? Okay, so now I want to talk about the pros and cons of this camera when it comes to video. And pros first. So This is a really solid 1080 camera. 1080 up to 60 frames per second, so you can slow it down that little bit, 40% if you're in a 24 frames per second timeline. And I will continue to say that 1080 is a sweet spot for a lot of people who are creating content for web, social media, even YouTube. If you're filming in 1080 and again upscaling, exporting to 4K, that's going to really not miss out on any quality issues because of how YouTube compression works and compression on social media as well. 4K is going to be compressed down to the point that you're really not going to see a lot of benefits from filming in 4K versus filming in 1080 when your final delivery is for something like YouTube. And an advantage to filming in 1080 is that you're going to save a lot on storage costs, and that's also going to be easier to edit in whatever software you're using, and you're just gonna have a faster workflow because of those things. This camera also has eye autofocus in video, and that is a feature that full frame cameras at this price point, other than this one, don't have. And then you also get good colors straight out of camera with this. You have the color profiles and they're nice. If you want to try a little bit of color grading, or you know how to color grade, you can download the CineStyle profile and use that to have a little bit more flexibility with your color grading, but you don't need to. And that's kind of the story of this camera in video. It's not the best video quality. It's not the best camera specifically for video, but it is really easy to get solid quality video from this camera. So now the cons for video with this camera, and the first one is again going back to 1080 versus 4K. This is only a 1080 camera, so if you do need 4K, it's not really an option. Again, it technically is in the RP, but with a 1.7 times crop, with no usable autofocus options, and with terrible rolling shutter. So the only way that you can realistically use this as a 4K camera is in a static shot on a tripod with manual focus. And for most people, again, if you do need 4K, this 4K is not going to cut it. However, I do think most people, especially if you're looking at a camera in this price range at all, you probably don't need 4K, like I said, because of delivering to web content. Another con for this camera in video is that it does not have any in-body sensor stabilization in video like the R5, R6, and R3 have. And it does have electronic image stabilization, and the electronic image stabilization does work relatively well for certain shots. Sometimes it's not going to work so well. If I'm being honest, I don't use it especially for client work, because there are just those few times when it is going to kind of mess up the shot a little bit and give it that electronic stabilization wobble, and I can't trust it so much for client work. So I don't consider this to have any type of stabilization that I would use regularly for professional work. For vlogging or something, I do think that the image stabilization, the electronic mode, will work just fine. Another con for this camera in video for me is that it only shoots 8-bit 420 and doesn't have any 10-bit footage options. And I do want to clarify that a little bit, because I think a lot of people get confused on if and when 10-bit is going to be helpful for them. And what this camera is made for, again, is just someone who wants to get good looking video quickly and easily. And if you're not color grading, which this camera isn't really built even with any profiles that are great options for color grading, you can add CineStyle if you want to do a little bit of color grading. But if you're not color grading your footage regularly, you're not really going to see the benefits of 10-bit footage over 8-bit footage. If you do just want something, again, that's quick and easy and good looking right out of camera, 8-bit 420 is going to be absolutely fine for that. But if you do want to be color grading more and have a little bit more flexibility in being able to push your footage, then 10-bit is going to have a lot of advantages there over the 8-bit footage. Another con in video with this camera is that there really isn't any option for slow motion beyond 60 frames per second. Now, that isn't necessarily a con for everybody, and honestly for me, I don't shoot 120 frames per second very often. I almost never shoot 120 frames per second because I'm not shooting action. And if you're shooting stuff that isn't action, 120 frames per second and beyond tends to be too slow and doesn't really look good to slow it down that much. And for me, when I'm shooting slow motion, I am almost always shooting at 60 frames per second, which this camera has in 1080. And 60 frames per second looks really good for stuff that isn't action. But if you do shoot action, or you do need, for whatever it is that you're shooting, 120 frames per second, this camera doesn't have that option at all. And I have always said that this isn't really a great option for someone who is primarily a professional video shooter. If you are a professional videographer primarily, I would probably suggest that you invest more money into a camera that has better video features. But to be fair, I will say I have been using this camera pretty regularly as a B camera for my client video work, and it's worked fine for that. I use CineStyle a lot, and I can color match it to my other cameras pretty well. And I will also say that even if you are primarily video focused in your work, but your work is mainly for creating content that's going to be delivered to your clients' social media, I do think that this can actually work pretty well for that, as long as you're not needing something where you can do heavy color grades on it. So the reason I'm selling the RP is honestly, I just want to buy the R6. And that's been ever since I tested the R6 at the beginning of this year. I really enjoyed the camera and have really wanted to buy it. And I don't necessarily need to buy the R6, which is why I've put the purchase off for several months, and I've tried to be patient with making the purchase rather than just getting it because I want it. But I'm getting less and less patient, and probably within the next few weeks I will have sold the RP and picked up the R6 in its place. And having said that, it's basically just a want the new camera thing. There are actually a few areas where the RP wasn't working for my workflow, and the biggest one, again going back to photography, is shooting with studio strobes, off-camera flash in a studio situation with the electronic first curtain shutter. I just can't depend on it reliably to shoot in those situations, and so I just haven't been able to use it for that. And for video, it's kind of tricky saying that the RP wasn't doing what I needed it to do for video, because again, I have been using it as a B camera very successfully with a lot of my work. But there are some things that I really would like a little bit more from this camera in video, or from my camera that I will be using in video. One of them is just a log profile. I would like to be able to have a log profile and to have more control over color grading than what this camera allows me. And I would also like to have something that has better 4K options, realistically usable 4K options versus what the RP has in it. But I will also say that 4K isn't typically a huge part of my regular workflow, so it's not necessarily, again, something that I have to replace because of that. A lot of the client video work that I do is actually for social media or something that's going to end up on the web, so 1080 again does actually work fine for that in most cases. And again, I don't shoot a lot of 120 frames per second, so it's not necessarily that I need something that has 120 frames per second, but it will be nice to have something that has the option when I do need it. So overall, I really do think the RP is still a great option for a lot of shooters, especially photographers, and especially if you're a natural light only photographer, you're not using studio strobes on a regular basis, and you don't need 2 SD card slots or 2 memory card slots, then you get full frame image quality on a really competitive budget versus any other options for full frame cameras right now. And again, it's also a good option for social media video creators because it's a really compact, easy, well-priced way to get good looking video in a quick, fast, easy workflow. But I do think that it's still one of, if not the best options for a camera to be small to take around when you're hiking or traveling or just for walking around with. And again, at the price point, it's one of the best value for price options out there. And over the next few months, it's likely or possible at least that the price of this camera will go down or go on sale during the holiday sales, and then it's going to be an even better deal for the price. So I do think that this camera is still relevant even right now for a lot of shooters. But what do you think? Have you ever shot with the RP, or are you looking into getting the RP? What have you shot with it, or what would you plan on shooting with it? If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button and then hit the bell icon so that you can get notified every time that I make new videos here on this channel. Thanks, see ya.